Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to IISS. My name is Virginia Comolli. I'm the Research Fellow for Security and Development here at the Institute. We are very pleased to host this panel discussion tonight on the impacts that illicit trade has on development and governance. This is an issue that IISS has done some work on, and over the years we've looked at how organized crime and illicit trade coalesce with conflict and instability and fragility. And we are certainly very much interested in exploring even further the strategic implications of organized crime and illicit trade in particular. So certainly we are, as I said, very happy to have this panel of experts with us tonight. The main trigger for this panel discussion was a publication recently published by Christian Aid, a report that you can find on the table outside alongside a number of region-specific case studies. And some of these case studies will be discussed tonight by some of our speakers. But first we will hear from Eric Gutierrez, who's a senior advisor at Christian Aid and is the main author of this recent report by Christian Aid. Then we'll hear from Dr. David Mansfield, who is an independent consultant who has done extensive work in Afghanistan, and he will speak, of course, of the Afghanistan case studies. We'll hear also from Dr. Jacopo Grajales. You'll see him on the screen over there. He's a professor at Lille University in France with extensive field research experience in Colombia. And then we'll hear from Andy Morgan, who is a freelance author and journalist with extensive experience of West Africa and the Sahara region, and we will be discussing the case study of Mali. So I will turn to Eric first, so please.
Yeah. Thank you, Virginia, and on behalf of Christian Aid, we also would like to thank IISS for hosting this event. We produced this report and the case studies as a way of contributing to the ongoing discussions and in preparation for UNGAS, the UN General Assembly Special Session on Drugs, that's due to be held in April 2016 in New York. And one of the things that we would like to bring in is a more development-focused discussion on, how does the illicit commerce in drugs affect poverty eradication and development. One of the things that made us caught our attention in trying to do this is there are a lot of there's a lot of difficulty in drug control policy and a lot of paradox that come out. So. We wanted to understand more about those paradoxes. So, for example, drug traffickers are often considered as they're criminals, they're outlaws, but their very survival actually depends on the amount of connections that they have with legal authorities, with law enforcement, with they use the normal banking institutions for laundering their money. So it's the assumptions about the illicit, that there's a clear boundary between licit and illicit is actually less pronounced when you go deeper into this paradox. We also found that one other paradox is there are a lot of career criminals who have taken steps of running for political office and actually winning the becoming the democratic choice of fully informed voters, and so it's like a process of the politicization of criminals and at the same time the criminalization of politics. So these are quite a few of the issues, and what we wanted to do was actually to dig deeper into the context in various countries, and that's the reason why we started commissioned case studies, and we looked for a number of experts who may be able to provide us with that kind of understanding on in the context. So I won't discuss more. There's a lot more I think we can learn from the case authors, but The reports are there. Take as many as you want, and it's also available online if you need an electronic copy, so that it's easier to do a search, word search, and those kinds of things. But yeah, I'll end there and then hand over to the case authors. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dave.
The loudspeakers don't work.
I'm sorry?
The loudspeakers don't work.
I think they work in this bit too distant.
Does that work? It does, right, okay. Ooh. I will lean in. If I get a bad neck, I'll let you know. I did the Afghan case study. As Eric and Virginia said, I spent a little too much time working in Afghanistan. And it's quite interesting. So I wrote the original report in 2013, and it was called Eyes Wide Shut, which was basically an accusatory comment around the development community and the wider donor community and its engagement on drugs in Afghanistan. And Eric approached me 2 years ago and said, we need to have a new paper. And I said, well, unfortunately there was a good degree of prognosis in that paper, and I suspect we can update it. And it will still be just as relevant. So we produced an updated paper called Eyes Still Wide Shut, which was a reference to the development community. Maybe we should actually call it Eyes Wide Shut and Hands Over Ears. I don't know, maybe that would work as well. But basically my work is fundamentally, I come at this from a development background. I don't come at this from a drug control background or a drugs background. I come at this whole subject from a development background. And I've spent the last 20 or so years working on generating evidence of how different interventions, both drug control and development, have impacted on rural communities in Afghanistan. And through this work, I've examined the role illicit drug crops play in the lives and livelihoods of rural communities, and also identified the costs and benefits of different interventions, drug control and development, and how these are distributed across different locations and population groups. Over time, this work has also involved more about political settlements, how drugs and drug control efforts have supported political settlements, undermined them, and supported and undermined political bargains in the periphery at the local, regional, national level, and even international level. The kind of deals that were struck to deliver on drug control efforts out in the state building project in Afghanistan. So, now, one of the big pushes on this whole discussion is the fact that UNGAS is coming, the whole General Assembly. And when it comes to the UNGAS discussions, I mentioned earlier that I am this special session on drugs. I find myself on a good day feeling rather sceptical, perhaps agnostic, but most of the days simply confused. Where do we go in the future in relation to drug control, drug reform, if that's indeed the way, the direction of travel? And what, in particular, does this mean for rural communities in the global south who currently produce and trade in illegal opium and coca? The equivocal position I have is largely a function of both the policy process that I have found myself engaging in over the last 2 decades, and I recognise a few people who have also been involved in it, but also the empirical work I have been doing over that time. In terms of the policy environment, this is an environment, particularly when it comes to drugs policy, where opinion is so much more important than evidence. And I can't tell you how many times I've been confronted by a senior policymaker with the remark, why don't we just? Why don't we just, 1, buy all the crop up in Afghanistan and turn it in medicine to be sold? 2, why don't we buy all the crop and destroy it? 3, why don't we just destroy it by spraying it with chemicals, dumping large amounts of water on it, killer fungus, good old Pleospora, or I think there's been the odd idea about getting rabbits to eat the leaves. And finally, the other policy option has been to legalise it and tax it. Whenever I've heard these remarks, I would always reflect back on the word just. Why don't we just? When it comes to Afghanistan and drugs, there is no place for the word just. Perhaps the best example I can think of this kind of, some people call it a policy dialogue, I would err on that, was a meeting in Whitehall that involved 1 Lord, 2 generals, 1 Dame, a Member of Parliament and myself. A bit like the Englishman, Irishman, Scotsman joke, but involved people of dignity. This was a conversation predicated on the view that opium crop in Afghanistan should be bought up and turned into morphine to sell in the international market, due to the prevalence of people dying in pain, unable to afford analgesics. It was easy. When I subsequently brought evidence to the table and suggested to the group that Afghan opiates were in fact 10 times the cost of producing opiates in Australia, where farmers use improved seeds, mechanised harvesters, and grow opium on 35-hectare plots, with few opportunities for creating jobs and income, I was informed that this was all very interesting, but let's park those details and carry on the conversation as before. This is an exemplar of how much of the conversation around drugs takes place, and is pretty indicative not just within the diplomatic community but also amongst the development community. The second reason for my confusion regarding UNGAS is my empirical work, and we were talking about this earlier. Illegal opium production has not been all bad for Afghanistan. It's the country's largest export. It's created 400,000 plus full-time employment jobs, which is larger than the ANSF, which we've invested so much money in. It's boosted the legal economy. It's provided livelihoods to farmers and other service sectors across the country, and only over the last few years has brought 265,000 hectares of agricultural land under production that wasn't under production before. This is the desert spaces of the south and southwest. Tell me a development project that's achieved that. It's provided houses and homes for particularly poor farmers, good food, even motorbikes, solar panels, and allowed asset accumulation. So it's not been all bad. And I think it touches on an important point, and that is illicit opium cultivation would not do the same in Afghanistan. Afghanistan simply cannot compete with current illicit producers, Australia, France and Spain. Not a chance in the world. It doesn't have the infrastructure, the capital, the farm size, and the movement, if they were to actually become efficient on the global market, they'd have to move to concentrate of poppy straw method, which has none of the jobs and income. So illicit cultivation in Afghanistan is clearly not as destructive as widespread crop destruction, but nevertheless has significant implications for the Afghan economy and no doubt other producing countries in the global south. So here we have in Afghanistan an agricultural commodity that in large part due to its illegal status provides significant jobs and income, has supported the transformation of parts of rural Afghanistan, but at the same time, again, because of its illegal status, has fueled corruption and in many areas exacerbated the conflict in Afghanistan. While in parallel, war, trauma, poverty and availability has also led to growing problems of drug use among some of the most marginal communities in Afghanistan. Given this situation, what does the development community have to say about the drugs issue in Afghanistan or about the upcoming debate in UNGAS? Not much at all. In fact, silence, more generally. There's a few people who are engaging, but on the whole, hence the title, Eyes Still Wide Shut. On the whole, I find it's all more hand-wringing and more assuming the problem away, the why don't we just? And part of that, and again, it was something we touched on earlier, it's almost as if we can park the conversation, because if someone just legalizes production, somehow we won't have a problem in Afghanistan. And it's just not the case. We have a different problem. We have a different distribution of costs and benefits. And these are the things that we really need to have to consider as a development community and as others amongst the drugs community as well. So my own view at the moment is that far too much of the debate, the current debate on drugs policy, can appear a bit Western-centric. It's more about how can we regulate and control drug use in the West, manage production often domestically, certainly if you look at the examples that we have going through with Colorado, Uruguay, potentially Mexico, etc. And it's so we can manage production domestically so as to better minimize the impact of drug use and the corruption associated with illegal production on Western societies. These are all valid objectives, but they ignore the global south and the producers in the global south. There's almost no consideration given to how these measures, reform, legalization, decriminalization, regulation, or other measures will have on producing nations in the global south, who have the comparative advantage in illicit drug production, not licit drug production. More generally, no matter what happens at UNGAS in 2016, there is a need for much greater involvement by the development community in the discussion on drugs and on the debates on ways forward, particularly in relation to those countries in the south where illicit drug production is currently concentrated. After all, how do you engage in a country like Afghanistan where 90% of global opiates are produced? How do you design and implement and assess rural development programs where opium is such an important part of the rural economy? And how do you understand basic statistics on economics, demographics, migration, without a deep understanding of the role illicit drugs play in the political economy of the country? Yet even 2 days ago, the World Bank issued a report, Afghanistan Poverty Status Update, makes no mention of poppy as a coping strategy to deal with poverty, to deal with the shocks that communities experience. It really is pretty close to incompetence, quite frankly. There's this continued ignorance around this issue and its failure to engage. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, David. It's now time to turn to the case study of Colombia. So we turn to Jacobo in Lille, who will give us his views.
Very much. I will keep it very short in order to give some time to the general discussion. My study on Colombia analyzed how paramilitary groups transformed organized crime, local politics, and small agrarian property in Colombia over a period of more than 20 years, since the middle of the 1980s until the middle of the 2000s. It looked into the politicization of criminal actors on the one hand, so the engagement of criminal actors in a process of counterinsurgency, and also a more general process of criminalization of Colombia's internal conflict, of interaction between political violence and criminal violence. In other words, my objective was to examine the scope of the action of criminal actors in one specific case, the issue of violent and grabbing in Colombia. So I will say I will deal with some general issues concerning this subject, and then we might be able to have more discussion on some of these details. First of all, I think that one important thing about the link between organized crime, in this case, drug traffickers that were engaged in the political conflict as armed militias, as counterinsurgent militias. One important thing is to remember that violence is actually not enough in this process of land grabbing. Actually, paramilitary groups needed what scholars call social capital in order to legalize these illegally obtained assets, this land. So there was a process of property laundering, I might say, that started since the 1980s, with a very strong involvement of drug traffickers, of armed militias, into a very strong involvement in agribusiness, in different activities linked to the access to land. One important thing about the fact that these people actually needed to obtain title deeds was the objective of introducing investment, they needed to have a legal form of property. So that's the reason why they needed a form of support from politicians and civil servants. These links to the state, to different kinds of categories of actors inside the state, was a part of the regular functioning of the institutions in many parts of the Colombian territory. Today, I might say that a lot of challenges remain. Even if paramilitary groups, as I studied them in my research, do not longer exist with these characteristics, there are still many challenges concerning the links between crime, politics, and the state in Colombia. In the specific issue of access to land, of the use of land, and in more general development issues, I think that the criminal inquiries that are currently being led by the Attorney General Office, but also the Supreme Court, and that started in 2006, 2007, are especially important in order to establish the responsibilities in the institutions that are in charge of the legal certification of property. The problem is that actually some firms have actually managed to launder their image, even if they had by the past links with these paramilitary groups. They have managed to present themselves today as actors of a possible post-conflict in Colombia. And one thing that is important about the construction of peace in Colombia today, that is a very an issue that is currently being debated in Colombia, is the fact that there is no rupture between the logics of legal and illegal land grabbing in this country. The fact that actors, corporate actors, for example, can be able to pass from a configuration where violence and links to criminal groups can be a key asset in the distribution of property to a more pacified configuration. So the issue right now in Colombia is not forgetting the fact that in the local fields that scholars are currently studying, even if there's a strong recognition of property, of whole property, even if there's a program of redistribution of property to victims of violence, even if this issue of the links between armed violence and problems of development, of rural development, has been addressed both by the Colombian government and by international donors. In the field, when we go to the Colombian countryside, we see that illegal actors have managed to transform themselves into corporate legal actors. And I think that the main interest of this case study is to go back in history and to show how this configuration of violence and of continuity between violence and legal action, between the market and between the legal market and the criminal market has formed in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now from Colombia to Mali, Andy.
Thank you very much. Unlike the other participants, I didn't actually write the report that's been presented. It was written by someone called Christina Anderson, who unfortunately can't be here, and I've been asked to kind of advocate it. And the reason I was asked, and I think the reason that the report was commissioned, is that myself and the report's commissioner share a deep love of Mali. And people often ask why Mali is a lovable place, especially the north. It's just a completely deserted wasteland. Why should anybody care? Why should anybody love that place? And I think the answer is simply the people, the interaction that they have with each other, and some rather extraordinary social capital that country continues to exude and continues to seduce visitors with, despite all the problems that's been happening. And I think the impetus to commission this report came from a realization that all Mali's problems are very, very complex, that drugs was possibly playing a very, very large part in them, and that the net result of all this activity, all this suffering, was that Mali was beginning to lose some of the social capital that makes it a truly great country. And why has all this happened? As in all the other regions that we're visiting, the issue is very, very complex. Basically, Mali is a very problematic. The way Mali was put together in independence was problematic from the word go. It was a conjunction. It was a bringing together, a bunging together in one bucket of very, very different peoples with different cultures, with different language, with different ethnicities. And in a way, the problems of Mali reproduce the problems that are seen throughout the Sahel between northern nomadic desert communities and southern sedentary ones. And there was a big rebellion in 1990. A lot of southern Malians lost their lives. It flared up again in 2006. And the Malian government in Bamako decided that the only way that they could really contain the problem in the north was not to keep sending young Malians up to feel completely lost and up in this desert wasteland, which is as strange to them as Alaska is to an inhabitant of New York. But to actually deal with the problem by more or less hiring or doing deals with local businessmen who are men of means and who have got the money and the power and the influence to put together militias that they can then with which they can then take the fight to the mainly Tuareg insurgents. That's simplifying the issue a lot, because in 1991 a lot of the people who were then later fighting the militias were actually fighting alongside the Tuareg rebels, but I won't go into that because you might find that a little too difficult to deal with at this time of night. But basically, this policy encouraged people with known links to the drug trade to become political players, in effect, to become proxy armies doing the job of the Malian army in northern Mali. It gave them a lot of power. It also really exacerbated ethnic tensions between the Tuareg and the Arabs, between Tuareg and Songhai and the Fulani and all the other the ethnicities that make up the north of Mali. And it basically encouraged illegal activity, criminal activity, notably kidnapping, which killed the tourist trade, which was one of the economic lifebloods of the north, and also killed the involvement of outside NGOs employing white people who could no longer go there and do their work and employ local people, etc., etc. But it also introduced the idea that that drug trafficking was a very convenient get-rich-quick mode that could give you not only the means to be a big person, a big player, someone who protected their family, someone who protected their clan. There's no power in northern Mali without money. To be powerful, you have to be rich. You have to be able to feed a lot of people, to provide a lot of people who are tied to you by family lines, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these people basically accepted drugs, that drugs were a new reality, something that they could benefit from. And so drugs were introduced into the area, one of the poorest areas in the world, a bit like a absolutely super strong hormone might be introduced into the body of a little child. I would say that's more or less the effect it had. And the result was that these bigwigs then basically use the money, use their advantage to then pursue other agendas that weren't pro-government. Many of them went on to join some of the armed groups that have become notorious, like the AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Mujao in Gao, and Ansar ad-Din. And suddenly, instead of containing the Tuareg rebellion, you had a north that was under jihadist occupation for 10 months, between April of 2012 and January of 2013. And you had a country where suddenly insecurity was the major issue in normal people's daily lives, not only in the north, but in the south as well. And so Mali, it seems to me, is a very different case to a lot of the countries that we've been studying today, Afghanistan and Colombia, because it's not a producing region, although recently methamphetamines have made their appearance and are being cooked locally, as they are in many other West African countries, especially Nigeria. And hasn't until recently been a major consuming nation, although that also is changing to the great consternation of Malian society in general, especially the older generation who really don't understand what their youth are going through. And it's basically a place of transit. It's a place where drugs go through, and because of the huge revenues they generate, change the political structure and the political system. And so arguments about whether drugs are a good thing, whether you can contain them and let legitimate economies be built on the back of them, you can sustain agricultural livelihoods, especially amongst the poor, don't don't really apply to Mali. I think for us, for people who've studied that part of the world, we're pretty unequivocal in our assessment that the arrival of drugs in Mali has been entirely a bad thing. But then that leaves the question of what can be done about it. And as I pointed out earlier, trans-Saharan trade is in the blood of desert communities. They have an absolute unerring instinct to pick up a commodity on one side of the Sahara, transport it to the other, and sell it at a higher price. It's been going on for centuries. And the problem is that even though there is a very, very lively debate about drugs and their effect and the fact that they are haram in a normal conception of Islam, there's also the feeling that one convoy, one job driving a car, a 4x4 for some kind of drugs lord, one rental of a bunch of cars and other equipment to a drugs warlord, just that one involvement, either for a young man or an older man in society, can open so many doors which remain inexorably closed at the moment because of the instability, because of the lack of opportunity, because of the fact that there are thousands of young people just sitting around in villages and towns with absolutely zero prospects. And so we need to understand all this, but we also need to admit that the fact that there is a demand here in Europe, it's our society that has created the demand. And in their own inimitable way, desert people are supplying that demand to the great detriment of society as a whole, I think.
Thank you very much, Andy. We now have about 20 minutes for questions and comments. Before we launch into that, let me invite you all to take part in a small drinks reception that we'll be hosting here just immediately after this event. So please stay so we can continue the conversation in a more informal way. So if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand, and I will ask that before you ask the question, you identify yourself. Anyone would like to open up the discussion? Please, the microphone is coming to you, this gentleman over here. No, there was this gentleman first, but okay. It's fine, it's fine.
Good evening. Richard White from MOD. I was fascinated with the talk from the panellists in the sense that Andy at the end talked about a situation as it began, whereas I felt Jacopo and David were looking at a situation that was where the government got involved far too far down the line. And you were talking about the feelings of the Malian people, Andy, and I'd like to ask David, because he's done, I know, a lot of empirical studies, what he actually would answer on that, on the feelings of the local people involved with the poppy cultivation, etc. And how much of it, I know there's the economic side, but how much of it goes in the way that Andy said, one small step will be get me out of my current position. Thank you.
David?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's been interesting over the years to hear, to have these conversations with farmers and this sense of context, that this isn't all about, it's not about pure economics, but there's a broader context in which drug crop cultivation takes place, in which people engage. There are certain acceptable social mores. I mean, there is the broad principle that somehow poppy cultivation, as Andy's mentioned about drugs in general, is haram, it's forbidden. But what to do? And, okay, there's a certain sort of narrative around that. Everything becomes acceptable. But when you're talking to farmers themselves who are eking an existence in a field, and they basically say, look, what is it I'm meant to do? I remember a few years ago talking to one guy who I turned up and he actually accused me of being behind the eradication the previous year. Started to get a bit annoyed because I was longitudinal work, revisiting. And he started getting a bit annoyed with me and saying, last time you turned up, they destroyed my crop. And started to blame me. And I said, no, that's not completely true. Last time I turned up, they'd already destroyed your crop. And look, your field's poppy again. And in fact, it looks like you've got more poppy. And this guy basically said, look, what am I to do? If I grow wheat, I've only got a jarib of land. My family goes hungry for 9 months of the year. If I grow poppy and they destroy it, my family goes hungry. What's the difference for me? So there was very little risk. And the opportunities in that particular area, dry Corrèze, no water, poor roads, therefore limited opportunities for moving horticultural crop, growing them and then moving them to market. And his major pronouncement was one in which the biggest traders in this area is the same guy who destroyed my crop. And I think a lot of that contextual aspect is, there's often this pursuit. One, there's a very clear sense of the economic realities of life and political realities of life in these remote rural communities. And the second is a drug control effort that is sometimes seen as out of context, often seen as out of context. It's one in which people would say, our main priorities are security, jobs, and anti-corruption. Yet, all we hear from Western is counter-narcotics. It wasn't exactly an altruistic development agenda in the way that this was perceived to be rolling out in rural space. And often it would be one in which, and the biggest trader in the area and the biggest problem is the guy who's eradicating my crop and he's involved in the drugs business. So there's these various disconnects within the discourse around drug control, the discourse around what the development was really trying to achieve, and the economic opportunities that exist in these areas. And that often led to great suspicions about what it is we were really doing there. Thanks.
Okay, you.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone. My questions will be for the entire panel. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former Customs and Excise Intelligence Analyst for transnational organised crime. Most of my work since I left has been in the ex-Soviet Union. And noting the earlier question from the gentleman from the MOD, I have to say that I think with a lot of the criminality on all kinds of goods and the corporate structures behind them now, I think there is a need in the West to bring in military intelligence type ways of thinking to identifying the indicators of the problems and perhaps get away from the criminal investigation to a criminal prosecution standard level. I think that's a major weakness in the real circumstances. My question is for the entire panel, which NGOs or international development organizations, and then which, shall we say, international law enforcement organizations do you think are starting to raise their game in joining things up? Not expecting perfection, but raising their game, and maybe by mentioning those, the audience can draw its conclusions about who still has some way to go. Thank you.
Okay. Wow. Yes, perhaps we could also take other questions before we return to the panel. Anthony?
Yeah, is it working? Yeah, okay. Anthony Hull, member here, member Risi. Something that I find that's a bit embarrassing is that some of the major players are British. They used to be in the Costa del Sol in Spain, then they moved to South Africa because of the extradition laws. So what's happening now, and this is the reason why we have so many MI6 agents in Kenya and that part of Africa, is that they're passing off the drugs from Afghanistan to Karachi, they're sending them to that part of Kenya, then they're sending them to South Africa, where all the Costa del Sol British criminals used to be, now they're all in South Africa. Then it gets parceled off back up into Spain, into Rotterdam. Why don't we have a presence in South Africa? That is my one question. And the other one, which is probably a bit controversial, is because last week the United Nations tried to decriminalize drugs. But because we have so many institutions like the DEA, HM Revenue and Customs and etc. They're institutionalized, so it's like a question of self-preservation. Some people don't want to have drugs decriminalized because it's become an institution, it's become an industry. Yes. The anti-drugs, the war on drugs, like the war on terror, which is, I'll leave it to yourselves, but I think we need to move forward, otherwise we're just going around in circles. So to encapsulate my questions, one is, why don't we target the British criminals that are the hub of this? They're based in South Africa, they moved from Spain to South Africa. And number two, the question of legislation.
Okay, thanks. Let's take one more. Louise, the lady at the back.
Thank you. Yedaya Rossini, International Alert. My question is for Hako. In the course of your research, did you look at the issue of legal corporate actors? And by legal, I mean the big multinationals that are in certain areas that have been benefited by land grabbing. Or there is even some who make further allegations that there was a connivance between armed actors and big businesses. Is that something that you look at? And I raise it because that's something that we come across in our work quite heavily, especially in the northern areas of the country, and that will mean a lot in terms of the peace process and the implementation of the agreements.
Okay, let's now return to the panel. Perhaps we could go in reverse order from where we started. So perhaps Andy first.
Which NGOs, transnational bodies are making a difference? I think in terms of Mali, one of the big problems is that there's a disconnect between one side of the Sahara and the other side of the Sahara. There are very few bodies that effectively link or deal with the Sahara as a coherent space, which is what it is. You know, we always think about it as a place that you just want to cross to get things from one end to the other, but that's not true at all. It has its own inherent culture, its own inherent society, its own inherent traditions, beliefs, and priorities. And actually, something like 90% of Saharan trade is small-scale trade, taking foodstuffs from one town to another. Often smuggling as well, because the borders that were created between 1960 and 1963 have turned this coherent space into a place that is fundamentally disjointed and dysfunctional. I think that can be said with certain amount of confidence. So I would say I don't know what NGOs or transnational bodies are making a difference. What I do wish is that transnational bodies, especially regional ones in the region, would start working better together and talking to each other more. And I'm thinking of ECOWAS, and I'm thinking of the Union of Maghreb States and all these other sort of CEMOC and all these other organizations. They need to become effective. They need to treat the Sahara as a special case, in my opinion. Why no presence in South Africa? I don't know. It's not my area. Sorry, I can't answer that at all. And the fact that the war on drugs has become an industry, it does seem to me to be the case. And certainly, and I believe a completely new holistic approach needs to be taken. I'm really interested, and a lot of the reports I read on Mali, they cite endless initiatives from ECOWAS, from the EU, from the AU. I can't believe the amount of money that's been spent, and it just doesn't seem to me to have made really a blinders bit of difference. So I would really concur with that. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Jacobo? We can't. It's muted.
The thing is that the law enforcement agenda engage separate sectors of the Colombian government and the international cooperation. So the law enforcement agenda of the United States, for example, that remains focused on issues of fighting against illegal drugs is kind of separated from the development agenda. There might be some links, but they remain kind of fuzzy. And yet, one important thing to say is that foreign donors have been pivotal in supporting actors inside the state that push for a development agenda in favor of small peasantry, in favor of alternative forms of rural development, for example. And in the current state of affairs in Colombia, that's an important thing. Concerning legal corporate actors, that's a very important question, because actually I was in Colombia this summer for a field research, and I found that I have the feeling that corporate actors now turn to more secure forms of land accumulation. For example, we have reports of corporate actors using former paramilitary as militiamen. Former paramilitary militiamen as security agents, for example, in a perfectly legal, within a perfectly legal contract, working contract. So, yet the presence of these people on the ground is a form of intimidation for peasant communities that are now trying to recover the land. And subject of legal corporate, of the role of legal corporate actors in land grabbing, is the fact that in many regions of Colombia, and you mentioned northern Colombia, I don't know exactly what your research currently is, but for example, in the Montes de Maria region, corporate actors profited from the falling in the prices of land, and they actually bought land from peasant populations that were unable to access their land. So it is very difficult and I don't think it's fruitful actually to draw a line between legal strategies and illegal strategies, because actually when we see in a very practical way on the field how it works, we see an entanglement of these logics.
Okay. Thank you. David.
Yeah, in terms of development institutions that have been engaged or are engaged, I think it's been very spotty, or it is very spotty. I mean, there's been moments where there has been quorum in terms of development organisations fundamentally getting involved. And I can think of, certain points, the Aga Khan Development Network, the European Commission, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, DFID, came together, and there was actually some momentum around engaging constructively on the discussion around drugs, rural livelihoods, and what this really meant in relation to development strategies for Afghanistan. But those quorums are just, they move on, they break down. When I think about the moments where we actually had that, there was, where all these groups came together, there was almost like a reality check. How do we engage in rural Afghanistan if we aren't talking about the drugs issue? It was just counter-intellectual to even bother. And there was this desperate push to get out beyond Kabul and get out into rural space. If you're going to do that, we are going to have to engage in this subject. So we saw that as one of the pushes to get these development organisations involved. There was the political push, and the political push around bad numbers. 2004 into 2005, 2007, the political pressure to engage on the drugs issue was there because we had bad metrics. It made Afghanistan and the state building project look bad. Where is the development community in support of this? There was also, and I think that was, you certainly saw that amongst the technocrats and various others, was how do we avoid bad policy? Because at that point in time, both at 04, 05 and 07, aerial spraying was the Damocles sword that hung over everyone's heads. Whether it was going to happen or not, there was definitely a very strong rhetoric around it. And many in the development community felt that if they didn't engage, then they weren't seen to be engaging in a sort of coherent and cohesive way. It was more likely to happen. And then finally, I think there was also the recognition of the risks. As they got into rural space, as they started doing more development efforts, particularly around irrigation, road building, etc., there was that sense of risk that we could actually be exacerbating drug crop cultivation. Our irrigation could be used to grow poppy. We're not going to look bad. But beyond that kind of sort of rather cynical position, it was also we could be consolidating the economic and political power in the hands of traffickers and others. So there was a combination of those things that meant people engaged. But if you look today, despite the fact that cultivation's gone up, I don't know if there are any development organisations that are actually talking about it. And as I mentioned earlier, the World Bank's producing literature on a fairly constant flow. And you have to do a word search to try and find opium in much of that stuff, despite it being such a fundamental part of the political economy of the country. So I hope that answers that question. In terms of South Africa, I have no idea. In terms of the move to just legalise, I mean, the point I have again is if you're talking in whatever direction the drugs debate moves, there are costs and benefits associated with different regimes. And the concern I have as someone who comes at this from a development background and has worked so long in Afghanistan and rural Afghanistan is there are costs that will be incurred by rural communities in those areas that need to be acknowledged and considered in terms of a scenario planning of the ways forward. And I think at the moment there isn't enough of that conversation that's taking place. It's almost as if we'll move from illicit to licit and the problems will go away and these communities will simply take up licit cultivation, job done. And that's simply not going to be the case. They just do not have the comparative advantage in illicit cultivation, and that will take place probably in Western countries typically Australia, France, Spain. Australia is already moving just from production in Tasmania into Victoria and is even talking about moving into the Northern Territories. So there's a worthy conversation around what would minimise the harm associated with the current regime, associated with illicit drugs, but we need to actually work it out better rather than have a sort of knee-jerk reaction. I hope that answers that question. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And now, Eric, you have the last word.
Yeah. One of the things that we looked at in the course of organizing these reports is to look at some anthropological studies. Because drugs, you look at reports about the mafia, about criminal engagement and all those things. But what I found useful was an anthropological study that actually looked at what explains the survival of criminals, of the mafia. And it proposes that you have to look at those they rely upon. That it's saying that any criminal organization will not survive a day if it doesn't get any protection from any other sector of society. That if it does not provide any type of service. So what emerges is that there is they rely on others, and then others rely on them, and it is this interaction that allows them some kind of space to be able to conduct, do their business, make money, and I think that's one of the things that may be useful in this discussion. I don't know much about criminal investigations or military intelligence or how it but I think there's a lot of useful ways to if we really want to deal and grapple with the problem, we will ask those questions. So for example, a criminal entrepreneur who comes to like what David was saying, if he's the one who's organizing the trade, provide some kind of economic opportunity for poor farmers for survival, and that becomes some kind of an interdependence, and then they would rely on laundering their money on lawyers and bankers. I mean, HSBC was investigated by the U.S. Senate for laundering the Mexican drug cartel's money. So they use legal institutions that that are there. So these kinds of interdependencies, I think, are it's one critical way of being able to understand and being able to situate them and try to look at how can different organizations intervene. The whole idea for this whole report is actually if we is to get development NGOs and development actors to be more involved. I mean, starting from David's eyes wide shut, that there is very little involvement. Now, whenever issues of drugs and criminality are put on the table, it's always treated as that's not our field. It's the field. That's a security issue. It's not ours to deal with. But as has been shown, there can this kind of silo and this kind of disjointed approach is not anymore tenable. There has to be greater integration, more interdisciplinarity about how to approach these problems, and instead of agencies pursuing their own institutional agenda, whether it's their role in the war on drugs, but there has to be multi-stakeholder, more integration in dealing with it, and there's still no silver bullet, so to speak, about this. But at least if we can use some of these various points to at least show us where to go. So it's like when you're climbing a mountain and it's foggy. That when you're going up, you somehow reach the top somehow, even if you don't know that but it's the kind of approach or methodology.
Well, thank you, Eric. Certainly your call for multidisciplinarity resonates well with us in the Security and Development Program here at IISS. So we'll certainly also bear that in mind. I'm afraid this is all we had time for. once again, please join us to continue the discussion over some drinks. But before we do that, please join me in thanking our 4 panelists. Thank you.